This is my true story. I raised my son with everything I had, working long hours, cleaning homes, and starving some nights so he could eat. I thought when he grew older and became successful, he would honor me, include me, and treat me as family. But when he planned a luxury vacation to Dubai, he never invited me. When I asked why, he laughed and said I was too old and would slow them down. That humiliation cut me deep. But what he forgot was my name was still on his accounts. You won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you what I did, comment where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent my whole life working for my son, not for myself, not for comfort, but to make sure he had a life better than mine. From the time he was born, my days and nights became about him. I cleaned homes, washed clothes, and scrubbed floors until my back ached and my hands were raw, all so I could pay for his schooling, his books, his food, and his dreams. I remember carrying him on my hip as I went to jobs, leaving him in the corner with a toy while I cleaned another woman's kitchen. I went without new clothes for years so that he could wear good shoes to school. I starved many nights so he would never sleep hungry. When he asked for money for class trips, I borrowed it from neighbors or took extra work, telling myself it was worth it just to see him smile. When he grew older, I saved every little coin I could so he could attend college. I worked double shifts, sometimes 3 houses a day, so that his tuition would always be paid. I sold my jewelry, the only things of value left to me after my husband died, just so he would never feel shame in front of his friends. And when he finished school and told me he wanted to start a business, I gave him everything I had left. I co-signed loans, I put my name on papers I barely understood, trusting him when he said he needed me to help him get started. I believed in him because he was my son. I told myself all those sacrifices would one day come back to me as love, as loyalty, as gratitude. When he took his first international trip, I remember how proud I was. He sent me a photo from the airport, smiling, holding his passport. I thought maybe next time he would take me too, that one day I would walk through an airport by his side, finally seeing the world not as a worker, but as a mother being honored. I dreamed of it often, traveling in my old age, not for luxury, but as a reward for all the sacrifices I made in silence. I pictured myself sitting on a plane, my son beside me, telling me that all I had done was not forgotten. Every time he succeeded, I felt it was my success too. I thought anniversaries, vacations, and celebrations would bring us closer. I thought I had earned a place in his world of comfort, a seat at his table, a ticket in his travels. I thought my sacrifices would always tie him to me with respect. But as I would later learn, sacrifice means nothing when the person receiving it no longer values the giver. What I saw as love, he saw as entitlement. What I gave as loyalty, he treated as weakness. And though I had built his future brick by brick, I would soon learn he was willing to erase me from it completely. The first signs that my son was slipping away from me did not come like thunder. They came quietly, in moments that at first I tried to ignore. When he began traveling more often, I noticed he never mentioned me in his plans. He would pack his bags, talk excitedly to his wife and friends about the places they would see, and I would stand nearby, listening, waiting for him to turn to me and say, "Mother, come with us." But that invitation never came. At first I told myself it was because the trips were short, maybe for work, maybe with friends, and I didn't want to burden him. I convinced myself he was just busy, that he would include me the next time. But the next time came, and then the time after that, and still he never asked me to come. I sat at home alone while he posted photos from beaches, hotels, and restaurants, smiling with others while I watched from a distance. When I asked him gently about one of those trips, he laughed and said it was not for me. "You wouldn't enjoy it, Mama. It's too tiring, too busy." His words stung, but I swallowed the pain. I told myself he was protecting me, thinking of my health, not rejecting me. I wanted to believe it because the truth hurt too much. But then he said something sharper one day when I asked again. He looked at me and said, "You'll ruin the fun." Those words stayed in my heart like a knife. To him, I was not just old. I was not just someone he left behind. I was someone who would ruin the joy of his life if I was present. Still, I tried to give him excuses. I told myself maybe he was stressed, maybe he felt pressured, maybe his wife wanted time alone with him. I wanted so badly to hold on to hope, to believe that he still saw me as part of his life. Every time he left, I sat in my room and told myself, maybe next time. Maybe he will remember me next time. I waited for that moment when he would knock on my door and say, "Pack your bag, Mama, you're coming with us." But that moment never came. Each trip became a reminder that I was being erased. Each photo he posted was proof that he could live fully without me, proof that he chose to live fully without me. Relatives and neighbors began to ask why I never traveled with him, why I was not seen in the pictures, why I stayed home while he lived in luxury. I smiled weakly and gave them excuses. I'm too old. I don't like planes. I asked him to go alone. Lies. All lies to protect him, to protect myself, to cover the truth that my son did not want me. And every lie I told left me feeling smaller, weaker, more humiliated. The distance grew in other ways too. When I tried to join conversations, he spoke over me. When I gave advice, he rolled his eyes. When I asked about his business, he told me not to worry, as if my thoughts were meaningless. He began treating me like I was invisible in his world, like my only job was to stay silent in the corner and not disturb the life he had built. My sacrifices had built that life, but in his eyes, I no longer mattered. By the time I realized how far he had drifted, I understood something painful. The bond I thought would keep us close was broken. The sacrifices I thought would tie him to me with gratitude had been forgotten. And though I clung to the hope of being included one day, deep down, I knew the truth. My son had left me behind long before he left for Dubai. The cruelest blow came one evening when I overheard him speaking with his friends. I was in the next room, folding laundry slowly with my tired hands, when his voice rose above the others, full of pride and excitement. He was bragging about his luxury Dubai trip, describing the hotels, the shopping malls, the desert safaris, the expensive dinners he had planned. His words were sharp and loud, filled with arrogance, as if this trip was the crown of his success. My heart ached as I listened, because once again, I had not been included. He spoke of the trip as though I did not even exist. I stood frozen, holding a shirt in my hand, waiting, hoping to hear him mention me, to hear him say, "I'll take my mother too." But no such words came. When his friends left, I gathered the courage to ask him directly. I walked into the room and said quietly, "Son, can I come with you to Dubai? It has been my dream to travel with you. I can be careful. I won't disturb anything. I just want to be there, by your side." For a moment, I hoped. For a moment, I thought maybe he would see the longing in my eyes and the years of sacrifice behind them. But instead, he laughed. Not a kind laugh, not a laugh to soften the moment, but a cruel, mocking laugh. He looked at me and said, "No one wants an old lady slowing us down." Those words struck me harder than any slap ever could. My chest tightened, my throat burned, and my eyes filled with tears that I fought to hold back. Old lady, slowing them down. Was that all I had become to him? A burden? A joke? Something to be excluded, not because of money, not because of health, but because of shame? He did not even try to soften it. He did not even pretend to respect me. In front of his friends, he had erased me, and to my face, he had humiliated me. In that moment, every sacrifice I had ever made flashed before my eyes. The nights I starved so he could eat, the mornings I rose before the sun to scrub other people's floors, the money I poured into his education, his business, his trips. I thought of the loans I had co-signed, the credit lines I had opened in his name, the years of exhaustion etched into my body, and all of that, all of me, was dismissed with one laugh and one sentence. I went to my room that night with a heart heavier than ever before. I sat in the dark, staring at the walls, hearing his words echo again and again. No one wants an old lady slowing us down. That was the moment love cracked into anger. That was the moment my sacrifices turned into weapons in my mind. Because while he thought I was powerless, while he thought I was just an old woman to be mocked, I remembered something he had forgotten. His entire empire of wealth and luxury rested on the foundation of my name. He thought he had left me behind. He thought I could do nothing. But he was wrong. His cruelty lit a fire in me, and I promised myself quietly that night he would pay for those words, not with my anger, but with the truth of his dependence. That night, after he laughed at me and called me an old lady who would slow them down, I sat alone at the table with my dinner untouched. The food in front of me was simple, bread and soup, but even that tasted bitter in my mouth. I looked across the table at the empty chair where he used to sit as a boy, smiling, telling me about his day at school. I remembered the nights when I would cut my portion in half so he could eat more, and the mornings when I would pretend I wasn't hungry so he could have the last egg. Those memories rose in my mind like ghosts, and each one reminded me how much I had given and how little he now gave back. My heart broke as I realized I was no longer seen as a mother, no longer seen as the woman who gave him life and built his future. I was seen as a burden, as a shadow, as nothing. As I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow, I felt tears burning my eyes. They rolled down my cheeks, mixing with the taste of salt and shame. I thought of all the years I had believed that my sacrifices would earn me love in return. I thought of how many times I had dreamed of traveling with him, seeing the world not as a worker cleaning for strangers, but as a mother sitting proudly beside her son. That dream shattered that night, replaced with humiliation so sharp it cut through me like a blade. He had not just excluded me from a trip, he had erased me from his life. I sat in silence, but inside me something shifted. Humiliation has a way of breaking a person, but it also has a way of hardening them. I felt anger rising through the pain, an anger that had been waiting for years, buried under loyalty and excuses. I had spent too long convincing myself he was busy, that he didn't mean it, that he would come back to me. But his laughter that night told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't coming back. He didn't see me as family anymore. He saw me as a nuisance, something to hide, someone to mock. And I decided then and there that I would no longer cry quietly while he lived on my sacrifices. I wiped my face, stood up from the table, and went to my room. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, an old woman with tired eyes, worn hands, and lines carved by years of struggle. For a moment, I felt weak. But then I remembered the strength behind every wrinkle. I remembered the nights of hunger I survived, the endless hours of work, the debts I cleared, the business I helped him build. And as I looked into my own eyes, I whispered to myself, "You are not weak. He is weak. He lives on what you gave him, and he will soon remember that." I went to bed that night not broken, but hardened. The humiliation still burned, but it no longer left me helpless. Instead, it became the spark that lit a fire of resolve inside me. If he could erase me from his life, then I would erase the comfort he thought he had secured forever. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I thought about everything my son had said to me and everything he had forgotten. He laughed at me, he mocked me, he treated me like I was useless. But what he didn't realize was that his entire world of comfort, his business, his so-called wealth, all of it was still tied to me. Years ago, when he wanted to start his company, he had no credit history, no financial standing, nothing to secure the loans he needed. It was my name, my signature, and my sacrifices that gave him the foundation to build his life. I had co-signed his loans. I had tied my credit to his accounts. I had put my trust in him completely, believing he would always honor me for it. But now, that same trust he took for granted had become my hidden strength. He thought he was independent. He thought he had built everything by himself. But in truth, his entire empire still had my fingerprints on it. He had forgotten that the bank saw my name before his. He had forgotten that the creditors called me first when payments were late in the early years. He had forgotten that I was the one who negotiated terms, who signed the papers, who made sure he had the funds to grow his dreams. Without me, there would have been no business, no trips, no Dubai. Every card he flashed, every dinner he paid for, every boast he made to his friends, it all stood on the foundation of my signature. And he laughed at me as if I had no power. As I thought about it, I realized that his arrogance was his greatest mistake. He believed age meant weakness. He believed that because I no longer worked, because my hands shook sometimes when I held a spoon, I had no influence. But what he didn't know, or what he chose to forget, was that legal power doesn't fade with wrinkles. My name on his accounts was as strong as ever. My authority over his credit was still alive. He had erased me from his life emotionally, but on paper, in the world that truly controlled his luxury, I was still there, and that was the power he had forgotten. I thought back to the moment he told me I would slow them down. I remembered his laughter, the cruelty in his tone, the arrogance in his eyes, and I whispered to myself, "You think I slow you down? Then watch how fast your world stops without me." The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight. All I had to do was remind him that his life was built on my sacrifices, my credit, my power. And I would remind him in the way he would feel the most, through his wallet, through his trips, through the very luxury he thought made him untouchable. That night, I planned my next steps. I knew the accounts he used. I knew the credit lines that funded his lifestyle. I knew the loans that still carried my name. And I knew exactly how to use them. He thought I was powerless, but he had forgotten that I was the one holding the key to the very life he bragged about. The very next morning, I woke up with a clear mind and a steady heart. I had spent the night remembering every detail of his arrogance, every word he had thrown at me, and every sacrifice I had made that allowed him to live the life he flaunted. Now it was time to turn those memories into action. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down everything I knew about his finances. The loans I co-signed, the credit lines still active, the business accounts that carried my approval, all of it. For years, I had stayed silent, letting him use my name like a ladder while he climbed higher and higher, thinking he no longer needed me. But now, I would pull that ladder out from under him. I started with the creditors. These were the same people I had spoken to years ago when his business was struggling, the ones who remembered my name, the ones who understood that legally, I still had the right to intervene. I dialed the first number with a calm hand. When the voice answered, I explained the situation in simple terms: misuse of funds, reckless spending, and my decision to revoke my co-signature approval. They asked me if I was certain, and I said yes with a firmness I hadn't felt in years. Within minutes, they began processing my request. His credit lines were frozen, his access to cash blocked. Next, I contacted the bank. I explained that I was withdrawing my support from all accounts tied to my name. I reminded them that I had legal authority as a co-signer, and I wanted every account flagged and restricted until further notice. They confirmed it could be done. They warned me that it would cause immediate disruption for him. I smiled quietly and said, "That is the point." By the time I hung up, his cards would no longer work, his loans would be suspended, and his financial empire would be crumbling in real time. I did not rush. I made every call carefully, documenting the process, ensuring that each step was legal, permanent, and irreversible. This was not an act of rage. This was an act of control, of justice, of a mother finally using the power she had carried quietly for too long. He had mocked me, dismissed me, erased me, but he had done it while standing on a foundation built with my hands. And now I was tearing that foundation away. When I finished the calls, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not because I had money, not because I had punished him, but because I had finally chosen myself over his arrogance. I had reminded both him and myself that I was not weak. I was not useless. I was not the old lady he laughed at. I was the woman who built his life, and now I was the woman who could unbuild it. The plan was complete, and all that was left was to wait. He thought he would board a plane to Dubai, smiling with his friends, showing off his wealth. But by the time he reached the airport, his wealth would be nothing but numbers locked behind frozen accounts. His laughter would die at the check-in counter. His pride would crumble in front of everyone. And I would be sitting at home, calm, knowing that justice had finally found him. The morning of his big Dubai trip arrived, and I watched him from the corner of the room as he strutted around the house, dragging his suitcase with pride, his voice loud and full of arrogance as he called his friends to boast one last time before leaving. He wore expensive clothes, sprayed himself with strong cologne, and looked in the mirror with a smile that made me sick. He thought he was untouchable, that his life of luxury was secure, that nothing and no one could stop him. He grabbed his passport, his wallet, and his tickets, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already been pulled away. I sat quietly at the table, sipping my tea, saying nothing. I let him walk out the door, thinking he was going to enjoy the trip of his life. As soon as he left, I stayed seated, calm, waiting. I knew what was coming. At first, there was silence. Then, after a few hours, my phone began to buzz. I glanced at it but didn't answer. The first call came from him, then another, then a message, then more calls. I let them ring, each one confirming what I already knew. He was discovering the truth. At the airport, when he handed over his card to pay for upgrades or check in his luggage, the system would have declined it. He would have tried again, maybe another card, and it too would have failed. His smile would have dropped. Panic would have begun to set in. His friends, standing beside him, would have looked at him in confusion. The airline staff would have shaken their heads, telling him his payment had been declined, that his booking could not be processed. He would have argued, raised his voice, but the facts were unchangeable. His accounts were frozen. I imagined the scene with clarity, every detail playing in my mind like a film. I could see his face growing red, his voice growing desperate, his hands trembling as he dialed my number again and again. His friends, the ones he bragged to so often, must have been staring at him in disbelief, whispering among themselves as his pride crumbled in front of them. The same son who told me I was too old, who laughed at me, who mocked me for being powerless. There he was, powerless himself, stranded in an airport with nothing. All his arrogance, all his wealth, all his talk, it collapsed in a single moment when the truth of his dependence hit him. The calls kept coming. Finally, out of curiosity, I answered. His voice exploded through the phone, filled with rage and panic. "What did you do? Why are my cards not working? Why are my accounts frozen?" He shouted so loud I had to pull the phone from my ear. But I waited until he was finished, until his anger turned into a desperate silence, and then I spoke in a calm, steady voice. "If I am too old to travel with you, then you are too broke to go without me." I didn't shout. I didn't explain. I didn't give him anything more. I simply hung up the phone, leaving him in the middle of the airport with his pride shattered and his trip destroyed. That day, as his friends boarded the plane without him, I sat quietly in my chair at home, sipping tea again, feeling no regret. He had told me I wasn't good enough to stand by his side. I showed him that without me, he couldn't even take a single step forward. The fallout of that day spread quickly, like fire that no one could put out. After I hung up on him at the airport, the phone didn't stop buzzing. He called again and again, each time his voice filled with more desperation, more fear, more rage. I let most of the calls ring because I already knew what he wanted. He wanted me to undo what I had done, to save him the way I had always saved him. But this time was different. I had no intention of rescuing him from his own arrogance. For years, I had been the silent safety net, the one he mocked while secretly standing on the foundation I built. Now, that foundation was gone, and for the first time in his life, he had to face the reality of living without me. By the afternoon, I began to hear from relatives. They called me, whispering, asking if it was true that my son had been stranded at the airport. His cards declined in front of everyone. I said nothing, but allowed my silence to speak for me. My silence confirmed what they suspected. His world had collapsed. The story spread quickly, from family to neighbors to his own circle of friends. Everyone knew what had happened. He, who once bragged about his wealth, his trips, his success, had been exposed as weak, dependent, and helpless. His humiliation was no longer private, it was public, and there was no way to hide it. Later that evening, he came storming into the house. His face was red with anger, his hands shaking as he threw his empty wallet on the table. "You ruined me," he shouted. "You destroyed my life. Do you know how embarrassed I was? In front of everyone, my cards didn't work. My tickets got canceled. My friends left me there. Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was loud, but his words carried more fear than strength. For the first time, I looked at him not as a son, but as a man undone by his own arrogance. I sat calmly, listening, letting him spill his anger. When he finally stopped, waiting for me to defend myself, I simply said, "You erased me from your life long ago. Today, I erase the comfort you thought you built without me." He stared at me, speechless. He wanted to argue, but the truth in my words silenced him. He had mocked me for being old. He had excluded me from his world, and yet here he was, begging for help from the same woman he said was useless. The humiliation I had carried for years was now his burden to bear. His pride, his reputation, his arrogance, all of it had crumbled in a single day. The fallout did not end there. His friends, the ones he boasted to, began to distance themselves. They didn't want to be connected to someone who couldn't even manage his own finances. His wife's family, who had once respected him, now looked at him with suspicion, wondering how much of his life was a lie. Slowly, the invitation stopped coming. The praise disappeared. He went from being the man everyone admired to the man everyone pitied. And in his silence, I saw it clearly. He finally understood that all his wealth, all his success, all his trips had never been his alone. They had been mine too, built on my sacrifices, tied to my name. Without me, he had nothing. For me, the fallout was freedom. For the first time in years, I no longer carried the weight of silence. I no longer endured his arrogance quietly. I had shown him and the world that I was not powerless. The humiliation he gave me turned into justice I gave him. And as I sat in my chair, sipping tea, I whispered to myself, he thought I would slow him down. I made sure he never moved at all. In the days that followed, the aftermath of what I had done unfolded slowly, like cracks spreading across glass until the whole window shatters. My son walked around the house with anger on his face, his pride broken, his confidence gone. He avoided my eyes because he knew the truth, and the truth was heavier than his rage. Every call he made to creditors was the same answer: accounts frozen, credit lines revoked, authority removed. He shouted into the phone, argued with bank officers, threatened to sue, but each time the answer was final. Your co-signer revoked authority, and she has every right. He couldn't fight it because the law was not on his side. For the first time, He faced the reality that everything he thought was his actually belonged to me. The humiliation grew worse for him when his friends returned from Dubai without him. They posted pictures online, photos of them laughing in luxury hotels, eating in expensive restaurants, standing on sandy beaches under the sun. In every picture, he was absent. People began to ask why he wasn't there. Whispers spread quickly that he had been stranded at the airport, that his cards had failed, that his mother had pulled the strings behind his downfall. He tried to deny it, but his absence in those pictures told the whole story. His pride, which he once wore like a crown, had turned into a curse. He was mocked quietly, pitied loudly, and avoided by many. At home, he tried to confront me again. He shouted about loyalty, about betrayal, about respect. He asked how a mother could do this to her own son. I sat silently, letting him speak, until his words ran out. Then I said simply, "I gave you everything. You gave me nothing. You erased me from your life, and I erased the lies you lived on." He wanted to argue, but my calmness crushed him more than my words. He stormed out of the room, slamming doors, but I could hear the fear in his steps. He knew there was no undoing what had been done. The aftermath for me was peace. For years I had been humiliated quietly, living as if my sacrifices were invisible. But now I felt lighter. I had turned my pain into action, and my action into justice. I began to smile again, not because I enjoyed his suffering, but because I finally felt free of the burden I had carried. I no longer felt powerless. I no longer felt erased. I had shown him and myself that I still had strength. Neighbors began to look at me differently. They nodded at me with respect, whispered to each other about how I had stood up for myself, how I had reminded my son that no matter how rich he thought he could not erase his mother. Their quiet respect warmed me more than his arrogance ever could. I realized then that sometimes justice is not loud, not violent, not cruel. Sometimes justice is simply the truth given at the right time, and in the quiet of my evenings, sipping tea, I felt no regret. He may have lost his pride, his trip, and his comfort, but I had regained my dignity. That was the true aftermath. When all the shouting ended and the humiliation no longer belonged to me, I finally understood what justice felt like. My son thought he was untouchable, that his wealth, his trips, and his pride put him above me. He laughed at me, called me old, erased me from his world, and told me I would only slow him down. But when I froze his accounts and left him stranded at the airport, I showed him the truth. Without me, he had nothing. His arrogance collapsed in front of his friends, his reputation shattered, and the luxury he bragged about turned into dust. That was not just revenge. It was justice. Because justice is not about shouting or violence. Justice is about balance. He had stripped me of dignity, so I stripped him of the comfort he thought was permanent. He had erased me in front of others, so I erased the mask he wore in front of the world. In the weeks that followed, I no longer felt small or invisible. I walked with my head high, knowing I had reminded him and everyone else that I was not weak, not useless, not forgotten. I was the foundation of his life, the reason he had wealth, the reason he had luxury, the reason he even dreamed of Dubai. Without my sacrifices, without my name, he would have been nothing. And when he mocked me, when he humiliated me, he forgot that power. But I reminded him, quietly, legally, permanently. He could rage all he wanted, but he could not undo what I had done. The law was on my side, the truth was on my side, and time was on my side. I used the funds I secured not for luxury, not to brag, but to live comfortably. I paid off the debts I still carried from the years I had sacrificed for him. I bought myself a warm coat, new shoes, and food without having to count coins. And then, for the first time in my life, I booked a vacation for myself. It wasn't Dubai, it wasn't luxury, but it was mine. I sat on the balcony of a small seaside hotel, sipping tea as the waves crashed against the shore, feeling peace I had not felt in decades. No one laughed at me there. No one called me old. No one erased me. For the first time, I was not living in his shadow. I was living for myself. And that is the real justice. He didn't invite me to Dubai because he thought I wasn't worthy, but I made sure he never left the airport, because without me, he was never worthy of the life he flaunted. He can never erase that lesson. Every time he looks at his empty bank accounts, every time he hears the whispers of friends who no longer admire him, every time he feels the sting of being left behind, he will remember. It was his mother who gave him everything, and it was his mother who took it away. Final thought. He thought age made me weak. He thought wealth made him strong. But I showed him the truth. Strength is not in money, or trips, or pride. Strength is in sacrifice, in endurance, in patience, and in the ability to choose the moment when silence ends. He didn't invite me to Dubai. I made sure he never even left the ground. That is Grandma's justice.